The invitation came with no details. There were no explanations. It was just a promise of discovery, a chance to challenge the limits of perception, it read. It was signed by Michael Ashford himself. Michael was an architect known as much for his mystique as for his unconventional designs. 6 people had taken the bait. 6 curious souls were lured by the whisper of the unknown. They were drawn by the reputation of the man now standing before them. He gestured to a room with no defining features. The group exchanged uncertain glances. Michael spoke with a clinical detachment. "This is the room," he said simply. His hands gestured toward the unbroken expanse of wall. A controlled space, perfect symmetry, no windows, no doors, seamless. "What you'll experience inside is entirely up to you," he continued. "Consider this." He paused. It was as if the words themselves were forming out of some secret he alone understood. A unique exercise in how we perceive confinement. They glanced at the room. 4 identical walls of smooth, pale gray surrounded them. The walls extended from the polished floor to a ceiling whose height was nearly impossible to guess. The harsh, artificial light added to the disorienting effect. It felt like standing in a void. It was as though someone had stripped away every trace of life. The room felt less like a room and more like a concept given form. It was a sterile space that might swallow any sound, any shred of personality. A faint whiff of disinfectant lingered in the air. It was sharp and unwelcoming. Without further warning, Michael motioned for them to step in. They entered one by one. There was little choice but to follow his direction. The last one in was Sophia. She hesitated as she crossed the threshold. Her eyes trailed back to Michael. He offered no reassurance. He just nodded as the entryway slid shut with an unsettling silence. The soft click was absolute, final. It was as if the wall itself had reclaimed its unity. There was no trace of the door they had just entered through. At first they only stood there, surveying their surroundings. Sophia, ever the skeptic, tried to maintain her composure. She brushed an errant strand of hair back. Her gaze traced the lines of the walls. "So, this is it," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. No one answered. The others were engrossed in the eerie uniformity of the space. Hands reached out to touch the walls as if to confirm their solidity. Isaac, a wiry man with the hands of someone accustomed to the grit of labor, ran his fingers along one wall. His brow furrowed. "It's seamless. Not even a crack or line," he murmured. He pressed his fingers harder as though expecting the wall to give under the pressure. But it didn't. The material was cold, unyielding. It was as if the wall mocked his efforts to find some weakness. Minutes passed in uneasy silence. Elena, the artist, shifted from foot to foot. She clutched her sketchbook to her chest. She wasn't used to feeling confined. Her work was all about space, about freedom. Her eyes flicked around the room. She traced invisible patterns as though trying to impose some structure on the blankness. "It's like being in a canvas that hasn't been painted yet," she whispered. The comparison felt oddly chilling. It was as if they were trapped in something waiting to be brought to life, a frame for a scene that hadn't yet unfolded. Sophia's hand flew to her pocket. She pulled out her phone in search of a signal. She grimaced. "No bars, figures," she muttered. The others checked theirs, each with the same outcome. It was as if the room were a far-off island. It was removed from any outside interference, and the silence, that eerie, consuming silence, settled around them like a weighted blanket. All right, we've had our look. Now, where's the exit? Jonathan, a pragmatic engineer with little patience for pretension, finally broke the silence. He moved to the wall where they had entered. He felt along the smooth surface with growing urgency. There was a door here. It can't just disappear. He slapped the wall with his palm. The sound was absorbed by the walls. It was as if it were swallowed by some unseen presence. "Michael," he shouted. His voice was muffled by the oppressive space. "Hey, open the door. We're done." But there was nothing, just the steady hum of lights overhead and the stillness of walls that seemed to mock their efforts. His voice echoed briefly. The silence crept back in. It was like water closing over a stone thrown into a deep well. Isaac's fingers fumbled over the wall. He pressed every inch, looking for seams, buttons, anything that could trigger an opening. He laughed. It was a hollow sound in the emptiness. "He's messing with us. There's got to be some mechanism here, something we're not seeing." But his voice lacked confidence. It trailed off as he pulled his hands away. He stared at them as though they'd betrayed him. The minutes stretched. The group's collective resolve began to crack. Every inch of that smooth, pale gray wall offered nothing but resistance. It was an indifference that was as unnerving as it was maddening. The light, harsh and clinical, began to feel oppressive. There were no shadows, no soft edges. There was no relief for the eyes. There was no sense of depth or warmth. Only the stark geometry of the room. It was perfectly balanced, an unfeeling monolith to restraint. Elena's fingers trembled as she raised her sketchbook. Her eyes darted across the walls. "What if there is no exit?" she murmured. The thought was barely audible. It was laced with the beginnings of dread. The others turned to her. Irritation and unease mirrored in their eyes. But deep down, each of them knew that question had already taken root. Sophia tried to keep her voice steady. He wouldn't just trap us here. This is all part of the experiment, she insisted. It was some psychological test to see how they handled confinement. Right? She asked. She looked around, her confidence waning. No one replied. In the corner, Jonathan slid down to the floor, his back pressed against the cold wall. He put his hands over his face. "Just breathe," he muttered. The sound was barely more than a whisper. There's a way out. There's always a way out. But as the silence stretched, the walls felt as though they were pressing in closer. The air grew thick with an unnamed tension. The realization crept over them, cold and inexorable. The room didn't need doors. It was whole, complete, and it did not care if they stayed or left. The hours dripped by like water from a rusty faucet. Each passing moment thickened the tension within the room. The walls seemed to absorb the growing dread. They swallowed their voices. They muffled their breaths. Exhaustion settled in. The group's initial flurry of movement slowed. Uneasy pacing took over. Their movements were punctuated by sharp whispers and frustrated sighs. Sophia had taken to studying the walls in obsessive detail. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface. Her fingertips traced the same sections over and over. She searched for even the faintest irregularity. Each time she pulled her hand away, she was met with the same haunting perfection. An uninterrupted smoothness met her fingers. It offered no promise of escape. Her nails had begun to leave faint scratch marks, but they vanished. It was as if the walls had absorbed them. It's almost organic, she thought. She shook her head as if to dislodge the idea. The notion was absurd. But but the feeling lingered, a strange pulse beneath her fingertips. It felt like a heartbeat buried under inches of cold, unyielding material. Anyone else feel it? Elena's voice broke through the quiet. Like the walls are alive? Elena had been silent for so long. Her words sounded strange. They felt like an intruder in the sterile silence. Isaac scoffed. His voice carried little conviction. Alive? He asked. It's a room, not a living thing. Don't start going all horror movie on us now. He forced a chuckle. The sound rang hollow in the emptiness. But even he couldn't ignore the chill that snaked down his spine. The feeling clung to him. It prickled the edges of his mind like needles. They agreed, reluctantly, to rest. It was Jonathan's idea. His voice was weary as he spoke, trying to impose reason on chaos. Whatever this is, we can't lose our heads. We'll conserve energy. Think this through. But no one truly rested. When they tried to sleep, the silence grew louder. It expanded to fill every corner of the room. Sleep, when it came, brought little relief. Visions filled their dreams. Walls pressed in. Whispers echoed within the confines of their own minds. When they awoke, something had changed. Sophia blinked. Her heart pounded as she took in the space around her. The room looked the same, yet it felt different. The walls seemed closer. The ceiling seemed lower. At first, she dismissed it as a trick of her exhausted mind. She thought it was an illusion brought on by the hours of confinement. But when she looked at the others, she saw the same realization glinting in their eyes. A spark of fear broke through their forced calm. Jonathan was the first to measure it. He moved from one end of the wall to the other in careful, precise steps. His breath came in short, ragged bursts. It's smaller. By a few inches, maybe, but smaller. I'd swear it. Silence blanketed the room as his words sank in. The walls were closer. Sophia felt her pulse quicken. Her mind struggled to grasp the implications. She reached into her pocket for a pen. She marked a line on the floor where the wall met the polished surface. Her hand shook as she pressed the pen to the cold, unyielding surface. The line left a thin, inky trail. They waited. All eyes were fixed on the line. Slowly, impossibly, the mark began to fade. The ink sank into the material. It vanished entirely. "What the hell?" Isaac whispered. His voice was barely audible. The wall had consumed the mark. It left no trace of it. He ran his hand along the spot. He hoped to feel some shift, some evidence of the line he had just watched disappear. But there was nothing. Only the smooth, empty surface remained. It defied every mark. It defied every attempt to break its flawless design. Panic rippled through the group. It was thinly veiled by forced calm. They tried marking the walls again. This time they used their nails. They used a button. They even used a belt buckle wedged against the surface. But every line, every scratch vanished. It was as if the room itself had swallowed their efforts. It was as though the walls refused to be altered. It was as if they held a quiet, malicious intent to remain perfect. As the hours wore on, the room's subtle, shrinking confinement grew more oppressive. The ceiling loomed lower now, or perhaps it was their minds tricking them. Their desperation blurred perception with paranoia. Isaac found himself ducking slightly. It was a reflex. He could feel the ceiling pressing down inch by inch. Elena's breathing grew shallow. She clutched her sketchbook, as though it could shield her from the room's merciless design. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "The walls, they're breathing." Her words hung in the air, absurd, yet somehow resonant. It was as though the room itself had taken on a pulse, an ebb and flow of quiet, unseen movement. She closed her eyes. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. She tried to feel it. For a brief moment, she was sure she sensed something, a faint, rhythmic pressure. It felt like the slow beat of a heart. Sophia's laughter, bitter and raw, cut through the silence. Are we really starting to believe this? It's a room. A room. But even as she spoke, her hands betrayed her. Her fingers brushed the walls in rapid, trembling strokes. Deep down, she felt it too. A presence in the walls. An awareness that watched them with quiet, detached malice. Jonathan slammed his fist against the wall. His frustration spilled over. This isn't just confinement. This is something else. Something designed. His words ignited something in the group. A shared understanding of the horror that had taken root in each of them. They weren't just trapped. They were being toyed with. They were held captive by something beyond their understanding. It was as if the room had a life of its own. It was a dormant intelligence. Their presence had awakened it. It fed off their desperation. It fed off their mounting dread. Sophia began to pace. Her steps grew more frantic. She muttered under her breath, "There's a way out. There has to be. Rooms don't just shift like this. This isn't normal." But her voice was thin. It frayed at the edges. Fear pried open the cracks within her. Isaac shook his head. A bitter smile tugged at his lips. "You think he didn't plan for this?" Michael knew what he was doing. We're the ones who didn't. He's watching us right now. He's enjoying the show. The accusation sent a shiver through them all. It was a chilling thought. It felt too plausible to dismiss. Michael Ashford, with his calculated smile and cryptic explanations, had brought them here for more than just an experiment in design. They were part of something darker, something meant to unravel them, thread by thread. As the realization settled, the hum grew louder. It was a soft, persistent noise. It vibrated through the walls. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. With each passing minute, it grew. It reverberated in their bones. It amplified their growing terror. Isaac pressed his ear to the wall. His brow furrowed as he listened. "It's almost like a heartbeat," he murmured. The others fell silent. Each felt the wall's rhythmic pulse. It seemed to sync with their own racing hearts. They sat in silence. The air was thick with tension. Each one clung to what little composure they had left. Somewhere, deep within the silence, the walls continued their quiet, menacing shift. The walls closed in by the faintest measure. An inevitable descent left no room for escape. They knew now, in the hollow silence, that the room was not just a trap. It was a prison designed to consume them. As they sat there, crushed under the weight of realization, the walls pressed closer. A pulse whispered promises of confinement. An ever-tightening grip fed off their panic and despair. Hours passed. None of them could say how many. Time had lost meaning. They were trapped in the stifling embrace of the shrinking, silent room. The hum grew louder. It was now a steady thrum. It seemed to seep into their skulls. It vibrated through bone and marrow. They were trapped in a loop, Panic and exhaustion consumed them. There was no energy left for denial. The walls were closing in, inch by silent inch. Jonathan, always the voice of reason, was the first to crack. He paced the room's perimeter, his hands pressed flat against the walls. He muttered, his movements jerky and frantic. The floor beneath him felt wrong now. It was too solid, yet somehow alive underfoot. It was like standing on something buried, but breathing. Every step he took sent a shiver up his spine. A whisper of dread lingered, one he couldn't ignore. His hands left sweaty prints on the walls. He watched them fade. It was as if erased by some invisible hand. Elena had grown unnervingly quiet. Her face was pale. Her eyes were distant. She clutched her sketchbook in white-knuckled hands she hadn't drawn in hours. The sight of it, once a comfort, now seemed absurd. Her gaze drifted, unfocused. It was as though she were somewhere else entirely. She muttered softly. Her words were barely audible. They were fragments that made little sense, but they carried an eerie weight. "It's hungry," she whispered. Her voice trembled as she traced invisible shapes in the air. Sophia sat with her back against one wall. Her knees were drawn to her chest. She rocked slightly, her fingers dug into her scalp. She whispered to herself. It was a mantra meant to keep her calm. "It's just a room. Just a room. It can't, but..." She squeezed her eyes shut. She felt the pulse of the room. It synced with her own heartbeat. It was a rhythmic reminder. They were trapped in a place that was no longer indifferent. It was a place that had awoken. It was somehow aware. Isaac was beyond whispers. Rage boiled inside him. A desperate fury exploded in fits of shouting. He cursed the architect who'd lured them here. He cursed the walls. He cursed the silence. He cursed the very air. "You're watching this, aren't you, Michael?" he roared. His voice was hoarse and raw. "You're sitting somewhere with your smug smile, watching us like rats in a cage." He pounded his fists against the wall. His knuckles split. Blood smeared the smooth, unyielding surface. But the room didn't care. It absorbed his fury. It consumed their hope. The walls pulsed once. It was a subtle, almost taunting movement. It was as if the room itself were laughing at them. The blood vanished. It sank into the surface without a trace. There was no evidence of his struggle. In the center of the room, Jonathan's pacing slowed. His gaze locked on a single spot on the floor, his face drained of color. He noticed something none of them had seen before. A faint hairline crack ran through the polished floor. It was barely visible, but it was there. He dropped to his knees. His fingers trembled as he traced the line. It was cold, unyielding. "Elena," he whispered. His voice was barely more than a rasp. "Look at this." She drifted over. Her expression was hollow. Her eyes were wide and unfocused. The others gathered around. They stared at the crack. The silence buzzed with fearful anticipation. It felt like a glimmer of hope. It was a way out, or perhaps just another cruel trick of the room's design. Sophia knelt beside Jonathan, her fingers pressed against the floor. It's something. It's the first anything we've found here." But as they stared, the crack began to widen. It widened slowly. It was deliberate. It teased them with the promise of escape. It grew wider, deeper. A faint, rank smell wafted up from the darkness below. It was sour and damp. It smelled like the breath of something ancient and decayed. A few of them retched. They gagged on the scent, but no one backed away. They were too desperate. They were hungry for a way out. Then slowly, the crack began to close. "No," Jonathan gasped. His hands clawed at the edges. He tried to keep it open. "No, please. This is it. This is our way out." His fingers scraped uselessly against the floor. The gap sealed itself with cold precision. It erased the last sign of imperfection. The floor was whole again. It mocked their desperation. The horror of it broke something in them. The thin veil of sanity they clung to began to fray. Elena sank to the floor. She clutched her head. A whimper escaped her lips. "It won't let us out. It never was going to let us out." Her voice trembled with a fragile, final understanding. Sophia's face twisted with something close to madness. A bitter laugh bubbled from her lips. "We're nothing to it. It's just watching us, like animals in a box. And every time we try something, every time we think we've figured it out, it just changes." Isaac sat against the wall. His face was pale. His knuckles were raw and bleeding. His eyes stared into the distance. Maybe there was never an exit. Maybe this is the experiment. To see how long it takes for us to lose our minds. The walls seemed to close in even tighter. They pressed against their sanity as much as their bodies. The ceiling was lower now. It was so close that they could reach up and touch it with their hands. The hum was louder. It vibrated through their skulls. It filled their minds. It was an incessant thrum that drowned out all thought. And then a sound. It was faint, soft. It was like the creak of wood, a shift in the very bones of the room. They looked around, disoriented. A small, darkened gap appeared in one corner of the room. It was a slit, barely large enough to crawl through. It was crude, jagged. It was as if the room had opened a wound in itself. They stared at it. They hardly dared to believe. They hardly dared to hope. Jonathan crawled forward. His body trembled as he peered inside. The darkness was thick, impenetrable. He turned to the others. His voice was ragged with fear and hope. It's an exit. I think it's an exit." One by one, they dropped to their knees. They squeezed through the narrow gap. They clung to the faintest hope that this might be their salvation. But as each of them crawled through, they emerged. They emerged into another room. It was identical in every way to the one they just left. The same seamless walls, the same unyielding silence, the same pulse that beat softly beneath the surface. Sophia let out a choked sob, her hands pressed against her temples. No, this can't be happening." Elena's eyes were wide with terror. She backed against the wall. She sank to the floor. It's playing with us. We're never getting out. It's just moving us, shifting us, trapping us in the same space over and over. Jonathan's voice broke. A hollow laugh escaped him. "We're not leaving. We're just being moved." He pressed his hands against the walls. His palms slid down as his strength left him. His voice was barely a whisper. "It's like a funhouse. Just mirrors and tricks and empty rooms." The hum grew louder. It was a triumphant, steady pulse. It reverberated through their bodies. It filled the silence with a finality that left no room for doubt. The walls pressed in again. They were closer, tighter. The ceiling was so low now that they had to crouch. They bent under the weight of the unyielding confinement, and then they understood. All at once, there was no escape. The room was designed to be perfect. It was seamless, a place without an exit, a place without flaw. They were trapped within its symmetry. They were bound by its walls. They were swallowed by its silent, pulsing void. As the last sliver of space closed around them, the hum faded. It left them alone in the dark. Their final breaths were swallowed by the room that had claimed them, one by one. In the quiet, somewhere just beyond, Michael Ashford sat in silence. He watched his creation come to life.